Good morning everyone and welcome to this new video. Today I am going to analyze the thinking of a great American psychologist, Watson, who was the father of behaviorism. Behaviorism is a current of thought that uses the observational method to study the correlation that exists between the individual and the environment. In the United States, until Watson founded this current of thought of behaviorism, there were two currents of psychological thought that had really taken hold. On one side was structuralism and on the other side was functionalism. Structuralism, the word itself says it, sees the mind as a chemical structure that can be broken down into simpler elements, sort of like how each molecule can be broken down into many atoms. Whereas functionalism compares mental activity to a river flowing in flood and therefore cannot be broken down into smaller elements. And it studies mental processes as tools that humans use to adapt in some way to their environment. So this confrontation, this open diatribe between structuralism and functionalism is somewhat interrupted by this new current of thought that founds our protagonist today, and thus Watson, with the birth of behaviorism. In fact, in 1913, Watson's paper came out, Psychology as the Behaviorist Sees It, which outlined a little bit of the aspects of this new approach. In fact, behaviorism abandons all research on the mind, all research on what are the components of the mind, etc., but only analyzes behaviors that can be observed. And so it takes as its object of investigation precisely behavior that is something that is empirically visible, that is observable, and that is measurable. Thus opposing, as I said, all those currents that instead are more introspective, go to analyze mental states, drives, etc. in favor instead of analysis of human behavior as responses to stimuli that come from the environment. In pedagogy, then, this approach translates precisely into the educator's search for appropriate learning circumstances. The studies and experiments that Watson did have their roots in experiments and studies that another scholar of the time, a great Russian physiologist, Pavlov, had already conducted. Pavlov, in fact, who was later also a Nobel Prize winner in medicine, was studying the digestive system of animals, and dealing with dogs he noticed certain characteristics. In fact, almost by chance, Pavlov discovered that dogs salivated not only in the presence of food, but also when they saw the attendant who was in charge of bringing them food. And so Pavlov, suspecting that this coincidence was not then entirely accidental, decided to associate an auditory stimulus with this food, namely the ringing of a bell, and he saw that the animals, precisely the dogs, after a short time had learned this behavior, that is, the moment they heard the bell. They began to salivate, because obviously the stimulus of the ringing of the bell was associated then with the arrival of the food. And he also noticed that after a while, even just the sound of the bell itself began to make them salivate. So even if no food arrived, the dogs associated the sound of the bell with the arrival of food and began to salivate regardless of the arrival of precisely the food itself. With this, he concluded that in learning, one could somehow condition the animal's behavior through a stimulus. Watson then decided to take these experiments that Pavlov had done and try to take them to humans, because he was assuming that all human behavior, or at least most of it, was attributable to learning based on conditioning. And so it seemed to him a good idea just to try to experiment more or less with what Pavlov had done, but on humans. So, together with his collaborator Rosalie Rayner, he decided to go to the orphanage and adopt a baby about 8 months old and try to do experiments on this baby. Experiments that were later highly criticized, controversial experiments. The very famous experiment precisely of little Albert. This child was already somewhat abandoned to himself and away from human care and human warmth because he was the child of a nurse at the orphanage. And he still appeared as a healthy baby who was even told that he had cried only once. The experiment was divided into several phases. In the first phase, Watson wanted to try to find out what were those external stimuli that could elicit a fearful reaction in the child. And so, at an early stage, he subjected this child to a series of stimuli precisely to find out what he was afraid of and what he was not afraid of. Watson soon realized that the child was afraid of practically nothing except the presence of very loud and very intrusive noises that somehow frightened and disturbed him. And this was, in any case, a characteristic common to somewhat all children, and he also sees that neither fire nor the presence of animals disturbed or frightened him. The next phase of the experiment consisted precisely in inducing, in some way conditioning, the child to be afraid. Initially, therefore, Watson showed the infant a white rat with which the child would want to play. But however, every time the child approached and somehow wanted to play with this animal, a very loud noise was produced, so loud that it frightened the child. Obviously, the consequence was that after a very long series of these very loud noises, every time the child approached and wanted to play with the rat, the child began to be afraid of the rat. Then, later on, the experiment continued with the child being subjected to the same treatment in the presence of other animals and also to pieces of fur. And the reaction was always the same. Basically, by now, the child was conditioned to be afraid, terrified of these creatures. Albert was subjected to these trials for a very long time, even a year. At the end of this experiment, it was noticed that the child, who initially was good, quiet, and had no particular problems, suffered from perpetual states of anxiety, was always nervous and always very, very agitated, and he was even terrified by a Santa Claus mask with a beard, which he was forced to touch and burst into uncontrollable, desperate crying right after touching this beard. Eventually, Watson was expelled from the university because of the cruelty of this experiment, which nevertheless remained one of the most famous experiments in the history of psychology. The last phase of this experiment was supposed to be to undo the conditioning and thus somehow decondition the child to be afraid in these situations. This second stage, however, was never carried out, and so nothing more was known about this child, at least until the 6th year of his life, when it was learned that he died of a congenital disease. After this experiment, Watson drew his conclusions and gave a speech that remained very famous, in which he said, in his own words, that if he had healthy, normal children, he could, in a proper environment, program them to become what he would want for them. So he really said, give me a dozen of these children, and I, in the proper environment, and being able to do experiments for quite some time, as I say, I can transform them and make them into doctors, medicals, lawyers, or even beggars and thieves, precisely because I condition them to become what I want them to be. This is regardless of their talents, inclinations, aptitudes, and propensities. The only thing Watson was asking for was to be allowed to act as he wanted, without interference from anyone. Such a talk was precisely aimed at emphasizing how important the educational aspect was to Watson. How important was the figure of the educator who somehow, through conditioning, could influence so much on the mental development and learning of the child, transforming him and making him grow in a certain way rather than another. This is obviously regardless of what are all the innate predispositions of the child. The learning, the development of the child is simply the response that the child has based on the external stimuli that it perceives. In this talk, he also emphasizes how important the educator is to children and how a good educator can convey those right stimuli so that children can grow up in a happy environment, make them feel adequate and equal to the social context in which they live. Well, with that, I have finished my talk on Watson. If you have any questions or any curiosity about it, you can ask me in the comments below as always. I salute you and refer you to the next video.